They laughed at the groom's poor father at the wedding, but when he started speaking, everyone cried upon hearing his words. Tom Simmons wiped his hands on a rag as the phone rang in his small auto repair shop. He answered, recognizing Jake's number. "Dad, we need to talk about the wedding," Jake said, his voice tense. "What's wrong, son?" Tom asked, concern growing. "It's just, there are some details we need to discuss. Can you meet me later?" Tom agreed, feeling uneasy about the conversation ahead. Later that day, Tom entered the local suit rental shop. The clerk eyed him suspiciously as he browsed the racks. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked, his tone slightly condescending. "I'm looking for a suit for my son's wedding," Tom replied. "Are you sure this is the right place for you?" the clerk questioned. Tom stood his ground. "Yes, it is." As he tried on a suit, Tom's mind wandered to a moment years ago. He saw himself showing a teenage Jake how to change the oil in an old Chevy. "See, son? It's all about patience and attention to detail," Tom had said. Jake had beamed with pride as he completed the task. The memory faded as Tom looked at himself in the mirror, the rented suit a stark contrast to his usual work clothes. That evening, Jake's car pulled up to the shop. He stepped out, looking uncomfortable in his expensive suit. "Dad, about the wedding," Jake began, avoiding eye contact. "What is it?" Tom asked, sensing his son's discomfort. Jake hesitated. "I think it's best if your friends from the shop don't come to the wedding." Tom felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "But they've known you since you were a kid." "I know, Dad. It's just Olivia's family. They're different from us. I don't want any misunderstandings." Tom nodded silently, hiding his hurt. As Jake was leaving, Tom noticed the price tag on Jake's suit jacket. His eyes widened in shock at the four-figure sum. "Jake, that suit, it costs more than I make in a month," Tom said, disbelief in his voice. Jake looked embarrassed. "It's what's expected, Dad. You don't understand." As Jake drove away, Tom stood in the doorway of his shop, feeling a growing distance between him and his son. The suit and the garment bag on his workbench seemed to mock him, a symbol of a world he didn't belong in. Tom sighed heavily, realizing that his son's wedding might not be the joyous occasion he had hoped for. Instead, it was becoming a stark reminder of the class divide that threatened to separate him from Jake. He picked up a wrench, finding comfort in its familiar weight. As he turned back to the car he was working on, Tom resolved to face whatever challenges lay ahead. His son was getting married, and he would be there, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. The phone rang again, and Tom answered, half expecting another difficult conversation with Jake. Instead, it was a regular customer with a simple question about an oil change. Tom found himself grateful for the normalcy of it, a brief respite from the emotional turmoil of the day. As night fell, Tom closed up the shop, the weight of Jake's words and the looming wedding heavy on his mind. He knew the next few weeks would test him in ways he had never experienced before. But he was determined to stand by his son, even if it meant facing a world that seemed intent on making him feel small. Tom pulled up to the Prescott mansion, his old truck a stark contrast to the luxury cars lining the driveway. He took a deep breath before stepping out, adjusting his rented suit. As he approached the entrance, he overheard Victoria Prescott speaking to another guest. "I can't believe Jake invited his father. He's just a mechanic. What will people think?" Tom's steps faltered, but he pressed on, pretending not to have heard. Inside, Jake spotted Tom and hurried over, a forced smile on his face. "Dad, you made it," Jake said, glancing nervously at the other guests. "Let me introduce you to Olivia's parents." As they walked, Jake whispered, "Try not to mention the shop, okay?" Tom nodded, his heart sinking. "Mr. and Mrs. Prescott, this is my father, Tom," Jake said, his voice tight. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. "How nice to meet you, Mr. Simmons." Mr. Prescott merely nodded, already turning away. Jake quickly steered Tom away, making excuses. Olivia approached, her smile genuine but uncertain. "It's good to see you, Tom. I hope you're comfortable." Before Tom could respond, Victoria called Olivia away. As she left, Tom saw Victoria whispering urgently to her daughter, shooting glances in his direction. Throughout the evening, Tom felt increasingly out of place. He tried to engage in conversations, but people would quickly find excuses to move away. During a lull, Tom found himself near a partially open door. He heard Jake and Olivia's voices from within. "Jake, we can't just sideline your father," Olivia said. I know, but you saw how everyone reacted. Maybe if he just comes to the ceremony and skips the reception. That's terrible. He's your father. You don't understand. This is important for my career, your father's firm. Tom stepped away, unable to bear hearing more. As the rehearsal wound down, Tom made his way to Jake. Son, I think I should head home, he said. Jake looked relieved. Sure, Dad. Thanks for coming. There was no hug, no warmth in the goodbye. Tom drove home in silence, his mind racing. He thought of Jake as a boy, eager to learn about cars, proud of his dad's skills. Now that same son was ashamed of him. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the truck, staring at the small house he'd raised Jake in. Photos of them together lined the walls inside, memories of happier times. Tom made a decision. He couldn't bear to watch his son be embarrassed by him on what should be the happiest day of his life. With a heavy heart, he decided he wouldn't attend the wedding. He went inside and poured himself a rare drink, toasting the empty room. To Jake and Olivia, he said bitterly. Tom spent the night looking through old photo albums, tracing Jake's growth from a grinning boy to the successful but distant man he'd become. In the early hours of the morning, Tom sat at his kitchen table, pen in hand, starting a letter to Jake explaining his decision not to attend the wedding. Each word felt like a knife in his heart, but he convinced himself it was for the best. As dawn broke, Tom headed to his shop, throwing himself into his work, trying to drown out the pain with the familiar sounds of engines and tools. A customer came in, noticing Tom's unusual demeanor. Everything okay, Tom? He asked. Tom forced a smile. Just fine. What can I do for you today? As he worked on the customer's car, Tom's mind kept drifting back to the rehearsal, to Jake's embarrassment, to the Prescott's disdain. Each memory strengthened his resolve not to attend the wedding. By closing time, Tom had finished the letter to Jake. He held the envelope, debating whether to mail it or deliver it in person. The thought of facing Jake again, of seeing the relief in his eyes at Tom's decision, was almost unbearable. Tom placed the letter on his workbench, deciding to sleep on it before making his final decision. He locked up the shop and headed home, the weight of his choice heavy on his shoulders. That night, as Tom lay in bed, unable to sleep, he wondered if he was making the right decision. Was he being selfish, thinking only of his own feelings? Or was he truly doing what was best for Jake? The questions haunted him as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreams filled with memories of a young Jake, proud to be his father's son, mixed with the cold reality of the man Jake had become. Tom tossed and turned all night, sleep eluding him. The letter to Jake sat on his nightstand, a constant reminder of his decision. As the hours crept by, memories flooded his mind. He remembered the night Jake's mother left, leaving Tom to raise their son alone. Tom had stood in Jake's room, watching his sleeping 4-year-old, vowing to give him the best life possible. Another memory surfaced. Tom selling his prized classic car to pay for Jake's college application fees. He recalled Jake's excitement when he got accepted, oblivious to the sacrifice his father had made. Then, there was the time Tom worked double shifts for months to buy Jake his first suit for internship interviews. The pride in Jake's eyes when he landed that first job made it all worthwhile. As dawn broke, Tom reached for his phone. He dialed Jake's number, but hesitated, his finger hovering over the call button. After a long moment, he put the phone down, unable to go through with it. Later that morning, a knock on the door startled Tom. He opened it to find Jake standing there, looking uncomfortable. "Dad, can we talk?" Jake asked, stepping inside. Tom nodded, leading him to the kitchen. "About the rehearsal," Jake began. "I'm sorry if you felt out of place. It's just a different world, you know?" Tom waited, hoping for a genuine apology, but it didn't come. "I appreciate you coming, Dad," Jake continued. "It means a lot to Olivia and me." Tom felt a glimmer of hope. "So, you want me at the wedding?" Jake hesitated. "Of course, Dad. Just, maybe we can talk about what to say to Olivia's family? About your work and stuff?" Tom's hope faded. "What do you mean?" Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I might have told them you're retired now, that you used to manage a chain of auto shops." The revelation hit Tom like a punch to the gut. "You lied about me, about who I am." "Dad, you don't understand. The Prescotts, they're different. They wouldn't understand our background." Tom stood up, anger and hurt battling inside him. "Our background? You mean the life I built for us? The one that put you through college?" Jake had the decency to look ashamed. "I didn't mean it like that. I just wanted to fit in." "By erasing who you are, who I am." Tom's voice rose. "Dad, please. This is important for my future. For Olivia and me." Tom took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "I think you should go, Jake." Jake looked like he wanted to say more but thought better of it. He nodded and left, leaving Tom alone with his thoughts. Tom sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter he'd written. Everything in him wanted to mail it, to wash his hands of this wedding that made him feel so small. But as he looked around the kitchen, he saw reminders of the life he'd built, the marks on the wall tracking Jake's height as he grew. The dent in the fridge from when Jake tried to help with repairs, the photo of them at Jake's graduation, both beaming with pride. Tom thought about all the times he'd faced challenges head-on for Jake's sake. He'd worked through exhaustion, swallowed his pride, and pushed through pain, all to give Jake a better life. Now, faced with perhaps the greatest challenge of all, watching his son marry into a world that looked down on him, could he really back down? Tom stood up, a new resolve forming. He wouldn't hide who he was. He wouldn't let Jake or the Prescotts make him feel ashamed of the life he'd led and the work he'd done. He picked up the letter and tore it in half, then in quarters. He kept tearing until it was nothing but confetti. Tom looked at himself in the mirror, straightening his shoulders. He made a silent promise to himself. He would go to that wedding. He would hold his head high. And he would show everyone, especially Jake, the true value of a man who works hard and loves his family without shame. With newfound determination, Tom headed to his shop. He had work to do, both on the cars waiting for him and on planning how he would approach the wedding. As he worked, Tom thought about what he would say to Jake, how he would carry himself at the wedding. He was done trying to fit into a world that didn't want him. Instead, he would stand tall, proud of who he was and what he had accomplished. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Tom knew he'd face more judgment, more sideways glances, and possibly more hurt. But he was no stranger to difficult paths. He'd walked them all his life, especially for Jake. This time, though, he wouldn't be walking the path to please others or to fit in. He'd be walking it to stay true to himself, to honor the life he'd built, and to show his son the importance of integrity. As the day wound down, Tom felt a sense of peace settle over him. Whatever happened at the wedding, he would face it as himself. Tom Simmons, mechanic, father, and a man of unshakable character. Tom arrived at his shop earlier than usual, determined to catch up on work before the wedding. As he worked on a stubborn engine, his mind wandered to Jake. He remembered teaching Jake to change a tire, the boy's face scrunched in concentration. Now, Jake could barely look at him without embarrassment. Tom sighed, focusing on the task at hand. Across town, Victoria cornered Olivia in the kitchen. "Darling, about Jake's father," Victoria began. "Don't you think it would be better if he attended only the reception?" Olivia frowned. "Mom, he's Jake's father. He should be at the ceremony. Think of the photos, dear. He doesn't exactly fit in." Olivia felt a twinge of discomfort at her mother's words. Meanwhile, Jake sat in his office, staring at his phone. He wanted to call his dad to apologize properly, but pride held him back. He dialed Olivia instead. "Hey," Jake said when she answered. "I've been thinking about my dad." "What about him?" Olivia asked. Jake hesitated. "Maybe my mom's right about the ceremony." Olivia's voice cooled. "You can't be serious, Jake. It's just, you don't understand where I come from." "Then help me understand. Don't shut your father out." Jake sighed. "You're right. I'll figure it out." But as he hung up, Jake knew he hadn't been honest about his feelings. Olivia sat on her bed, troubled by the conversation. She thought about Tom, his kind eyes and warm smile. How could her family be so dismissive of him? She made her way to the living room, where Victoria was arranging flowers. "Mom, we need to talk about Tom," Olivia said. Victoria's smile tightened. "I thought we settled this, dear." "No, you settled it. I don't agree." "Olivia, please, think of our reputation. Is that all you care about?" The tension between them was palpable. Back at the shop, Tom was under a car when his phone rang. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. "Tom's Auto Repair," he said. "Tom, it's Frank Peterson." Tom remembered Frank, a client from years ago. "Frank, how are you?" "Great, thanks to you. Listen, I'm in town and heard about Jake's wedding. I wanted to thank you again. Tom was confused. Thank me? Remember that night my car broke down? I was on my way to close a huge deal. You stayed open late, fixed it for free. I made it just in time. That deal set me up for life. Tom was speechless. You're a good man, Tom. I never forgot that. As they hung up, Tom felt a renewed sense of pride in his work. The day before the wedding arrived, Tom was closing up shop when his phone rang again. It was Jake, his voice panicked. Dad, the car for the wedding. It won't start. Can you come look? Tom grabbed his tools. I'm on my way. He arrived at the Prescott mansion to find a sleek, expensive car in the driveway, its hood up. Jake and Olivia stood nearby, looking worried. Victoria watched from the doorway, her expression a mix of annoyance and disdain. Tom approached the car, all business. Let's see what we've got here. As he leaned in to examine the engine, he noticed something odd. The battery cables were disconnected. This wasn't an accident. Tom glanced at Jake, who avoided his gaze, then at Victoria, whose face remained impassive. He reconnected the cables and the car started immediately. All fixed, Tom said, wiping his hands on a rag. Olivia beamed at him. Thank you so much, Tom. You're a lifesaver. Jake nodded, not meeting his father's eyes. Yeah, thanks, Dad. As Tom packed up his tools, he overheard Victoria whispering to Jake. See, this is why he can't be at the ceremony. Grease stains don't come out of wedding photos. Tom's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He'd made a promise to himself, and he intended to keep it. As he drove home, Tom's mind raced. The mysteriously disconnected battery cables, Victoria's comments, Jake's averted eyes. It all pointed to one thing. They had engineered this situation to prove he didn't belong. But they had underestimated him. Instead of embarrassing him, they'd given him a chance to show his worth. Tom parked in front of his house, determination setting in. Tomorrow was the wedding, and he would be there, head held high. Let them try to exclude him. He was done hiding who he was. He stepped out of his truck, the weight of tomorrow's challenge settling on his shoulders. But for the first time in weeks, Tom felt ready to face it. Tom sat in his living room, staring at the suit hanging on the closet door. Tomorrow was the big day, Jake's wedding. Despite the events of the past few weeks, he was determined to be there for his son. The phone rang, startling Tom from his thoughts. It was Jake. Dad, we have a problem, Jake said, his voice tense. The wedding car broke down. Can you come take a look? Tom hesitated, remembering Victoria's disdain. Are you sure you want me there, Jake? Please, Dad, we need you. Tom sighed. I'll be right there. He arrived at the Prescott mansion, toolbox in hand. The sleek, expensive car sat in the driveway, hood up. Jake and Olivia stood nearby, looking worried. What seems to be the problem? Tom asked, approaching the car. Jake shrugged. It just won't start. Tom leaned in to examine the engine. Almost immediately, he noticed the disconnected battery cables. This wasn't an accident. He glanced at Jake, who avoided his gaze, then at Victoria watching from the doorway. Without a word, Tom reconnected the cables. The car started instantly. There you go, Tom said, wiping his hands. All fixed. Olivia beamed. Thank you so much, Tom. You're a lifesaver. Jake nodded, not meeting his father's eyes. Yeah, thanks, Dad. As Tom packed up his tools, he overheard Victoria whispering to Jake. See, this is why he can't be at the ceremony. Grease stains don't come out of wedding photos. Tom's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Back home, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that the car incident had been staged. A test, perhaps, or an attempt to embarrass him. He stayed up late, memories of Jake's childhood flooding his mind, teaching him to ride a bike, helping with homework, cheering at his graduation. How had they grown so far apart? As dawn broke, Tom made a decision. He would go to the wedding, head held high. He was done trying to fit into a world that didn't want him. It was time to stand tall, proud of who he was and what he had accomplished. Tom put on his suit, the same one he'd worn to Jake's college graduation. It was a bit tight now, but it would do. He looked at himself in the mirror, straightening his tie. You've got this, Tom, he said to his reflection. You faced tougher challenges. With a deep breath, Tom headed out, ready to face whatever the day might bring. Little did he know, the events about to unfold at the church would change everything. Tom arrived at the church, adjusting his rented suit. As he walked up the steps, he felt the stares of the other guests. Whispers followed him as he entered the building. Isn't that the mechanic? What is he doing here? How embarrassing for Jake. Tom held his head high, ignoring the comments. He spotted Jake near the altar, talking to the best man. Jake's eyes met his, and Tom saw a flicker of panic cross his son's face. Jake hurried over, glancing around nervously. "Dad, you made it," he said, his voice low. "Listen, we're a bit crowded up front. Why don't you sit in the back? It'll be more comfortable." Tom felt a pang in his chest but nodded. "Sure, son. Whatever you think is best." As Jake walked away, Tom saw Olivia watching the exchange. Her brow furrowed, and she bit her lip, looking troubled. Tom made his way to a pew in the back of the church. He sat down, feeling isolated, as the rows in front of him filled with elegantly dressed guests. Olivia approached Jake, her voice hushed but intense. "Jake, what are you doing? That's your father." Jake ran a hand through his hair. I know. It's complicated." Olivia shook her head. "It shouldn't be. He should be sitting with family." Before Jake could respond, Olivia's uncle stumbled over, clearly having had a few drinks already. "Hey, Jake boy," the uncle slurred. "Saw you talking to the grease monkey. Didn't know you were inviting the help to the wedding." Jake paled. "Uncle Bill, that's my father you're talking about." The uncle laughed. "Your old man's a mechanic? Well, I'll be damned. At least you moved up in the world, eh?" Olivia gasped. "Uncle Bill, that's enough." But the damage was done. Tom, sitting nearby, had heard every word. His face remained impassive, but his hands clenched in his lap. As the uncle stumbled away, Tom's mind raced back to the incident with the wedding car. The mysteriously disconnected battery cables, Victoria's smug look, Jake's averted eyes. It all clicked into place. They had set him up. They wanted to prove he didn't belong, to humiliate him in front of everyone. The realization hit Tom like a punch to the gut. Olivia, seeing the pain in Tom's eyes, made a decision. She marched over to where he sat, her white dress rustling as she moved. "Tom," she said loudly, causing nearby guests to turn and stare. "I'm so sorry about my uncle. What he said was unforgivable." Tom looked up, surprised. "It's all right, Olivia. I've heard worse." Olivia shook her head. "No, it's not all right. None of this is." She turned to face the crowd of guests. "I want everyone to hear this. Tom Simmons is not just Jake's father. He's a man of integrity, someone who raised an incredible son on his own. He worked hard to give Jake every opportunity, including the education that led him to me." The church fell silent. Jake stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock. Olivia continued, her voice strong. "If anyone here has a problem with Tom being at this wedding, they can leave now, because I won't marry into a family that can't respect the man who made Jake who he is today." Victoria stood up, her face red with anger. "Olivia, what do you think you're doing?" Olivia met her mother's gaze. "I'm doing what's right, Mom. Something I should have done from the beginning." She turned back to Tom, extending her hand. "Tom, would you please come sit in the front row? That's where you belong." Tom stood slowly, overwhelmed by Olivia's words. He took her hand, and together they walked down the aisle, past the stunned faces of the guests. As they reached the front, Jake stepped forward. He looked at his father, then at Olivia, his expression a mix of shame and admiration. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. Olivia's right. You should be up here with us." Tom nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The church buzzed with whispers as Tom took his seat in the front row. Victoria sat rigid with anger, while Olivia's father looked thoughtful. As the wedding ceremony began, Tom felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, he felt truly seen and appreciated. Olivia stood at the altar, her eyes shining as she looked at Jake. But before the minister could begin, she turned to the congregation. "Before we start," she said, her voice clear, "I want to thank Tom Simmons. Without him, none of us would be here today. He's the reason Jake became the man I fell in love with." She paused, looking directly at Tom. "Thank you, Tom, for everything." As the ceremony proceeded, Tom sat tall in his seat. He may not have fit in with the wealthy crowd around him, but at that moment, he knew he belonged there more than anyone. The wedding ceremony began with a soft melody from the organ. Tom sat alone in the back pew, his eyes fixed on Jake at the altar. The church was filled with the rustle of expensive fabrics as guests settled in their seats. As the minister started speaking, Jake's mind began to wander. Memories flooded his thoughts. Tom teaching him to ride a bike, running alongside until Jake found his balance. Late nights at the kitchen table, Tom patiently explaining math problems Jake struggled with. The day Jake got his college acceptance letter, Tom's eyes brimming with pride as he hugged his son. Jake blinked, trying to focus on the present. He glanced at the back of the church, seeing his father sitting alone. A wave of shame washed over him. The minister turned to Olivia, prompting her to begin her vows. She took a deep breath and started speaking, her voice clear and steady. Jake, I promise to love you, to support you, to be your partner in all things. Olivia's eyes drifted to Tom. She saw the hurt in his expression, the loneliness in his posture. Her words faltered for a moment. Jake noticed her hesitation. He followed her gaze to his father, feeling a knot form in his stomach. Victoria, sensing the shift in atmosphere, leaned forward in her seat. She caught the minister's eye, making a subtle gesture to speed things up. The minister nodded slightly, rushing through the next part of the ceremony. Tom watched the scene unfold, feeling increasingly out of place. The weight of the day, of Jake's rejection, of the constant stares and whispers, became too much to bear. Quietly, Tom stood up. He took one last look at Jake, then turned towards the exit. Jake, in the middle of his own vows, saw his father's movement. In that moment, all the memories, all the love and sacrifice his father had given him, crashed over him like a wave. Stop, Jake said, his voice echoing through the church. The minister paused, confused. Olivia looked at Jake, concern in her eyes. I can't do this, Jake continued. He turned to face the congregation. Not like this. Victoria half rose from her seat. Jake, what are you doing? She hissed. Jake ignored her, his eyes fixed on Tom. Dad, wait, please. Tom stopped at the church door, his hand on the handle. I've been an idiot, Jake said, his voice cracking. I've been so caught up in trying to fit into this world that I forgot who I am. Who made me the man I am today. The church was silent, all eyes moving between Jake and Tom. Dad, would you come up here, please? Tom hesitated, then slowly made his way down the aisle. Whispers erupted among the guests. As Tom reached the altar, Jake embraced him tightly. I'm so sorry, Dad, he whispered. Pulling back, Jake addressed the congregation again. This man taught me everything I know about hard work, integrity, and love. He sacrificed everything to give me opportunities he never had. Jake turned to Olivia, taking her hand. Olivia, I hope you'll forgive me, but I need to say something before we continue. Olivia nodded, squeezing his hand encouragingly. Jake faced his father. Dad, I want you to speak. Tell everyone here who you really are. Who we really are. I'm done being ashamed of where I come from. Tom looked at his son, seeing the boy he raised shining through the man before him. He cleared his throat and turned to face the crowd. Victoria stood up. This is ridiculous. We're in the middle of a wedding. Olivia's father gently pulled her back down. Let the man speak, Victoria. Tom took a deep breath. I'm not good with fancy words, he began. I'm just a mechanic. I've worked with my hands all my life. When Jake's mother left, I didn't know how I'd manage. But I knew one thing. I'd do whatever it took to give my boy a good life. As Tom spoke, the church fell silent. Even those who had looked down on him earlier were captivated by his words. I worked double shifts. I sold everything I had that was worth anything. I learned to cook, to sew, to be both mother and father. And every sacrifice was worth it, because I got to watch my son grow into a man any father would be proud of. Tom turned to Jake, his eyes shining. I am so proud of you, son. Not because of your job or who you're marrying. I'm proud because you're kind, hardworking, and honest. At least you were until recently. A ripple of awkward laughter went through the church. But today, Tom continued, I see that boy again. The one who wasn't ashamed of his old man. The one who knew the value of hard work and integrity. Jake wiped his eyes, nodding. Tom addressed the congregation one last time. I may not fit in with all of you. I may not have fancy clothes or a big house, but I have something money can't buy. A son who makes me proud every day, and that's worth more than anything in this world. As Tom finished speaking, the church erupted in applause. Jake hugged his father again, this time without hesitation. Olivia, tears in her eyes, joined them. Tom, thank you, she said, for raising the man I love. The minister cleared his throat. Shall we continue with the ceremony? Jake looked at Olivia, then at his father. Yes, he said, but with one change. Dad, will you stand up here with me? Tom nodded, his heart full. As the ceremony resumed, Tom stood proudly beside his son, finally where he belonged. Tom stood at the altar, his hands shaking slightly as he faced the congregation. He glanced at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. "I never thought I'd be standing here," Tom began, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat and continued. "I'm not used to speaking in front of crowds. My hands are more comfortable with wrenches than microphones." A few chuckles rippled through the church, easing the tension. "But I'm here because my son asked me to speak, and I've never been able to say no to Jake." Tom's voice grew stronger as he continued. "I've been a mechanic all my life. It's honest work, and I've always been proud of it. But I wanted more for Jake. I wanted him to have choices I never had." He paused, looking directly at Jake. "Son, there's something I never told you. When you got accepted to college, I was over the moon. But the tuition, it was more than I could afford." Jake's brow furrowed in confusion. "I didn't want you to worry," Tom explained. "So I made it work. I told you I got a loan, but that wasn't true. I sold our house." Gasps echoed through the church. Jake's eyes widened in shock. "I sold the house your mother and I bought when we got married. The house you grew up in. I sold it and moved into that small apartment above the shop." Tom's voice cracked slightly. "It wasn't much, but it was our home. All those memories. But I knew your future was worth more than any building." The church was silent now, all eyes fixed on Tom. "I worked day and night in that shop to make ends meet, but every time I got your grades, every time I heard the excitement in your voice about your classes, I knew it was worth it." Tom turned to the congregation. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I want you to understand something about my son." He looked back at Jake, who was fighting back tears. Jake comes from a family that values hard work, sacrifice, and love above all else. That's his heritage. That's what makes him who he is. The skeptical looks on many guests' faces had been replaced by ones of respect and admiration. "I may not have been able to give Jake fancy cars or expensive vacations," Tom continued, "but I gave him everything I had, and I'm proud of the man he's become." Jake stepped forward and embraced his father, no longer caring about the tears streaming down his face. As father and son separated, Tom addressed the congregation one last time. "So when you look at Jake, don't just see a successful lawyer. See a man who knows the value of hard work, who understands sacrifice, who has integrity in his bones." Tom's voice swelled with pride. "That's my son. That's Jake Simmons." The church erupted in applause. Even those who had looked down on Tom earlier were visibly moved. Jake stood next to his father, a mix of emotions playing across his face. He realized how far he had strayed from the values his father had instilled in him. The desire to fit in with the Prescott's world had almost cost him the most important relationship in his life. Olivia watched Jake, her eyes shining with love and newfound respect for both him and Tom. As the applause died down, Victoria Prescott suddenly stood up. Her face was a mask of conflicting emotions. "Mr. Simmons," she said, her voice carrying through the church. "I." Everyone held their breath, waiting to see what Victoria would say. Would she object? Would she cause a scene? Victoria took a deep breath, her usual composure cracking. "I owe you an apology." The church fell silent once again, all eyes now on Victoria. Tom looked at her, surprise evident on his face. Jake and Olivia exchanged glances, unsure of what was about to unfold. Victoria stepped into the aisle, her eyes locked on Tom. The tension in the room was palpable, as everyone waited to hear what she would say next. Victoria Prescott stood in the aisle, all eyes on her. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Mr. Simmons, I need to say something," she began. "Something I should have said a long time ago." Tom nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Years ago, my car broke down on the highway. It was late, and I was terrified. Every shop was closed, except for one." Tom's eyes widened with recognition. "A kind mechanic stayed open late to help me," Victoria continued. "He fixed my car and refused to accept payment. That mechanic was you, Mr. Simmons." Murmurs rippled through the church. "I never forgot your kindness, but I'm ashamed to say I didn't recognize you when we met again. I let my prejudices blind me." Jake stared at his father, then at Victoria, shock evident on his face. He realized how badly he had misjudged both his father and Olivia's support for him. Victoria turned to face the congregation. "I've been so focused on appearances and status that I forgot what truly matters." Tom Simmons might not have wealth or status, but he has integrity and kindness. That's the kind of man I want my daughter to marry into. Olivia, tears in her eyes, stepped forward. Jake, I love you. I've always loved you, not because of your job or who you're trying to be, but because of who you are, the man your father raised you to be. She hesitated for a moment, years of familial expectations weighing on her. But then she squared her shoulders and continued. I don't care about big houses or fancy cars. I care about building a life with someone who understands the value of hard work and kindness. Someone like you, and like your father. Jake, overwhelmed by the revelations and Olivia's words, looked from his father to his bride, then to Victoria. Inspired by the honesty in the room, other guests began to speak up. An older gentleman stood. I grew up poor, worked my way through college as a janitor. Now I run a Fortune 500 company. We shouldn't be ashamed of humble beginnings. They shape us. A woman in an expensive dress added, my parents were immigrants. They worked in factories so I could go to school. Tom's story reminds me of their sacrifice. More stories followed, each revealing the humble origins behind the seemingly glamorous facades. Jake listened, a mix of emotions playing across his face. He realized how close he had come to losing sight of what truly mattered. He had almost rejected his father and the values that made him who he was, all to fit into a world that, as it turned out, wasn't so different from his own. He turned to Olivia, taking her hands in his. Olivia, I love you, and I'm sorry. I've been trying so hard to be someone I'm not. I almost lost myself, and I almost lost you. Olivia squeezed his hands, encouraging him to continue. Jake took a deep breath, then faced the congregation. I've made a decision, he announced. This wedding as it is isn't right. It's not us. Gasps and murmurs filled the church. Victoria's face paled, fearing Jake was calling off the wedding entirely. We're not calling off the wedding, Jake clarified quickly, but we're changing it. Right here, right now. He turned to the minister. Sir, can we simplify this ceremony? Strip away all the expensive trappings and focus on what really matters. The minister nodded, a smile spreading across his face. Jake looked at Olivia. If you're willing, I'd like to marry you right now. Not as the man I've been pretending to be, but as the man I am. The man my father raised me to be. Olivia's face lit up. Yes, she said without hesitation. That's exactly what I want. Jake then addressed the guests. To everyone here, we apologize for the change in plans, but we invite you to stay and witness a ceremony that celebrates love, family, and the values that truly matter. He turned to his father. Dad, would you stand with me as my best man? Tom, his eyes glistening, nodded and moved to stand beside his son. Victoria, after a moment's hesitation, walked up to Olivia. May I have the honor of standing with you, dear? Olivia hugged her mother tightly. Of course, Mom. As the simplified ceremony began, the atmosphere in the church had transformed. Gone was the tension and judgment. In its place was a sense of authenticity and shared humanity. Jake and Olivia stood before the minister, ready to begin their life together with a new understanding of what truly mattered. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but they were prepared to face it together, grounded in the values of hard work, integrity, and love that Tom had exemplified all along. The church buzzed with a new energy as Jake and Olivia stood before the minister, ready to exchange their vows in a simplified ceremony. Tom stood proudly next to his son, while Victoria, her face a mix of emotions, stood beside Olivia. Jake took a deep breath and began. Olivia, I stand here not as the man I've been pretending to be, but as the man I truly am. The son of a hard-working mechanic who taught me the value of integrity, perseverance, and love. I promise to honor those values every day of our life together. Olivia, her eyes glistening, responded, Jake, I fell in love with you, not your job or your status. I love the man who has a kind heart and strong values. I promise to stand by you, to support you, and to remind you of your worth whenever you forget. As they exchanged rings, the atmosphere in the church was one of genuine joy and celebration. The pretense and judgment that had clouded the earlier part of the day had dissipated, replaced by a sense of authenticity and shared humanity. After the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jake turned to face the congregation. Thank you all for bearing with us through these changes. We'd like to invite everyone to join us for a reception, but not the one we originally planned. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the crowd. Jake continued, "Instead, we'd like you all to join us at my father's auto shop. It's where I grew up, and it's a place that represents the values we want to build our marriage on." Tom looked at his son in surprise. Jake smiled and added, "Dad, I hope that's okay with you." Tom nodded, too choked up to speak. As the guests filed out of the church heading towards their cars, Victoria approached Tom. "Mr. Simmons," "Tom," she began, "I owe you more than just an apology. I've been blind to what truly matters. Can you forgive me?" Tom looked at her for a moment, then extended his hand. "Call me Tom," he said with a smile. At the auto shop, the wedding reception was unlike anything the guests had ever experienced. Makeshift tables were set up among the tool chests and car lifts. The smell of motor oil mingled with the aroma of catered food. Jake and Olivia made their entrance, greeted by cheers and applause. They looked around the shop, taking in the unlikely wedding venue. "It's perfect," Olivia whispered to Jake. As the celebration continued, guests mingled, sharing stories and finding common ground despite their diverse backgrounds. The artificial barriers that had seemed so important earlier melted away. Tom found himself surrounded by people eager to hear more about his life and his work. He shared stories of raising Jake, of the challenges and joys of being a single father. Many listened with newfound respect and admiration. Victoria, initially uncomfortable in the unfamiliar setting, soon found herself engrossed in conversation with some of Tom's longtime customers. She was surprised to discover the depth of respect and affection they had for him. As the evening wore on, Jake clinked his glass, calling for attention. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, his voice carrying across the shop. "To my father, Tom Simmons. Dad, I lost sight of what's truly important. I forgot the lessons you taught me about hard work, integrity, and loving without conditions. But I promise you, I'll never forget again." Tears welled up in Tom's eyes as the guests raised their glasses. Jake continued, "And to all of you, thank you for being part of this day, for adapting to our last-minute changes, and for helping us celebrate what really matters: love, family, and being true to yourself." As the reception wound down, Jake and Olivia prepared to leave for their honeymoon. Before they left, Jake pulled his father aside. "Dad, Olivia and I have been talking," he said. "We want to postpone our honeymoon." Tom looked confused. "Why would you do that?" Jake smiled. "Because we want to spend the next couple of weeks helping you expand the shop. It's time I learned the family business." Tom was speechless. He pulled his son into a tight embrace, years of misunderstanding and distance melting away in that moment. As Jake and Olivia drove off, amid cheers and well wishes from the guests, Tom stood in the doorway of his shop. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Victoria. "You've raised an extraordinary son, Tom," she said softly. Tom nodded, his heart full. "We've all learned something today," he replied. As the last of the guests departed, Tom looked around his shop, now transformed by the day's events. He realized that this was more than just a wedding or a reconciliation with his son. It was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Jake and Olivia, but for all of them. With a contented sigh, Tom turned off the lights and locked up, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. But for the first time in years, he felt ready to face them. Stronger for the bridges that had been rebuilt and the truths that had been spoken. The sun was just beginning to set as Tom closed up the shop for the day. The past year had brought more changes than he could have ever imagined on that fateful wedding day. True to their word, Jake and Olivia had postponed their honeymoon to help Tom expand the auto shop. What started as a 2-week project turned into a complete reimagining of the business. Jake's legal expertise combined with Tom's mechanical know-how had transformed the modest repair shop into a thriving enterprise. They had opened 2 new locations in neighboring towns, each one maintaining the core values of honest work and fair prices that Tom had always upheld. Jake split his time between managing the business side of things and continuing his law practice, now focused on helping small business owners and working-class families. Olivia had surprised everyone by discovering a passion for mechanics. She'd spent months learning from Tom and was now running free car maintenance workshops for women in the community. As Tom locked the door, he saw Jake's car pull into the parking lot. His son stepped out, looking tired but happy. "Hey, Dad," Jake called out. "Ready for the big dinner tonight?" Tom nodded, a mix of excitement and nervousness bubbling up inside him. Tonight was the first annual community dinner they were hosting, bringing together people from all walks of life to share a meal and stories. An hour later, the Simmons' backyard was filled with people. The aroma of grilled food filled the air, and the sound of laughter and conversation created a warm atmosphere. Tom looked around, marveling at the diverse group. There was Mike, a longtime customer whose car Tom had been servicing for 20 years, chatting with Dr. Reynolds, a surgeon from the local hospital. Nearby, Victoria Prescott was deep in conversation with Sarah, a single mother whose car Tom had fixed for free when she couldn't afford the repairs. Jake clinked his glass, calling for everyone's attention. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," he began. "A year ago, many of us were strangers, separated by perceived differences in status or background. Today, we're here as friends, as a community." He paused, looking at Tom with a smile. "My father taught me that the measure of a person isn't in their wallet or their job title, but in their character and how they treat others. It took me a while to really understand that lesson, but I'm grateful I finally did." Olivia stood up next to Jake. "We wanted to take this moment to make a special announcement," she said, her eyes shining. "We're pregnant." Cheers erupted from the gathering. Tom felt his heart swell with joy as he hugged his son and daughter-in-law. As the excitement died down, Victoria stepped forward. "I have an announcement too," she said. "Inspired by Tom's generosity and Jake and Olivia's commitment to the community, I've decided to start a foundation. We'll be providing scholarships for underprivileged youth who want to learn a trade." Tom was speechless. He remembered the days when Victoria could barely look at him, and now here she was, carrying on the values he'd upheld his whole life. As the evening progressed, more stories were shared. People spoke of how the Simmons family had impacted their lives, from Tom's years of honest work to Jake's legal aid to Olivia's empowering workshops. Later, as the party was winding down, Tom found a quiet moment with Jake. "Son, I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've taken everything I tried to teach you and turned it into something amazing." Jake put his arm around his father's shoulders. "I learned from the best, Dad, and I'm sorry it took me so long to appreciate it." They stood in comfortable silence, watching as Olivia chatted with some of the guests. "You know," Jake said, "we haven't decided on a name for the baby yet, but if it's a boy, we were thinking of naming him Thomas." Tom felt tears prick his eyes. "I'd be honored," he managed to say. As the last of the guests left, Tom sat on the porch steps, taking in the quiet of the evening. He thought about the journey of the past year, the wedding that almost tore them apart, the reconciliation that brought them together, and all the growth that followed. He realized that his little auto shop had become so much more than just a business. It was a symbol of perseverance, of integrity, of the power of honest work. It had become the heart of a community. Olivia joined him on the steps. "Penny for your thoughts, Tom?" He smiled at her. "Just thinking about how life can surprise you. A year ago, I thought I was going to lose my son. Now look at us." Olivia squeezed his hand. "You know, when I first met Jake, he told me his father was his hero. It took him a while to remember why, but he got there in the end." Tom nodded, too moved to speak. As the stars came out, Tom Simmons looked up at the night sky, feeling a deep sense of contentment. He had faced judgment, overcome prejudice, and in the end, not only kept true to himself, but helped others see the value in doing the same. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a grandchild on the way, a growing business to manage, a community looking to him for leadership. But Tom was ready. After all, he was just a mechanic who had learned that with honesty, hard work, and love, you could fix almost anything, even a family. Here's an expanded version of Chapter 11, adding approximately 3,000 characters. Chapter 11, a year later, continued. As the evening wore on, Tom found himself deep in conversation with Dr. Reynolds, the surgeon he'd met earlier. "You know, Tom," Dr. Reynolds said, "your story has inspired me. I've been thinking about starting a program at the hospital, teaching basic car maintenance to our staff. Many of our nurses and orderlies struggle with car issues, and it affects their ability to get to work reliably." Tom's eyes lit up. That's a great idea. I'd be happy to help set that up. This exchange sparked a flurry of ideas among the remaining guests. Sarah, the single mother, suggested a carpool system for people in the community who couldn't afford their own vehicles. Mike, Tom's longtime customer, offered to sponsor a youth apprenticeship program at the auto shop. As Tom listened to the buzz of conversation around him, he realized that the impact of his life's work was reaching far beyond anything he could have imagined. Later that night, after the guests had left and the backyard was quiet, Tom sat at the kitchen table with Jake, Olivia, and Victoria. They were discussing plans for the future, their excitement palpable. "Dad?" Jake said. "Olivia and I have been talking. We want to expand the business in a new direction." Tom raised an eyebrow, curious. "What did you have in mind?" Olivia leaned forward. "We want to start a mobile mechanic service. There are so many people who can't afford to bring their cars to the shop or who don't have the means to get there. We could go to them." Tom nodded slowly, considering the idea. "That could work. It would certainly help a lot of people." Victoria chimed in. "I could help with that. The foundation could provide a grant to get it started." As they continued to discuss the details, Tom felt a warmth spreading through his chest. This was more than just a family now. It was a team, united in their desire to make a difference. The next morning, Tom woke early, his mind still buzzing with the events of the previous night. He made his way to the shop, enjoying the quiet of the early morning. As he unlocked the door, he noticed a figure standing nearby. It was Frank, the man whose car he'd fixed for free all those years ago. "Morning, Tom," Frank said. "Hope you don't mind me stopping by so early." Tom shook his head. "Not at all. What can I do for you?" Frank shuffled his feet, looking a bit embarrassed. "Well, I heard about what you've been doing here. The expansion, the community programs. I want to help." Tom listened as Frank explained that he'd become quite successful over the years, thanks in part to the deal he'd been able to close because of Tom's help with his car. "I want to invest in your business, Tom," Frank said, "help you take it nationwide. Your values, your way of doing business, it's needed everywhere." Tom was stunned. The idea of his small-town auto shop becoming a national enterprise was overwhelming. Over the next few weeks, Tom, Jake, and Olivia had numerous discussions about Frank's offer. They weighed the pros and cons, always coming back to one central question. Could they maintain their values and community focus if they grew so large? It was Olivia who finally came up with a solution. "What if," she suggested, "instead of creating a big corporation, we created a network of independent shops? We could provide training, support, and our philosophy, but each shop would be rooted in its own community." The idea resonated with everyone. It would allow them to spread their message of integrity and community service while still maintaining the personal touch that had made Tom's shop so special. As the plans for this new venture took shape, Tom couldn't help but marvel at the journey that had brought them here. From the tension and misunderstanding surrounding the wedding to this moment of unity and shared purpose, it had been a year of tremendous growth and change. One evening, as Tom was closing up the shop, he found Jake waiting for him. "Dad," Jake said, "I wanted to thank you, not just for everything you've done for me, but for showing me what it means to live with integrity. I hope I can be half the father to my child that you've been to me." Tom pulled his son into a hug, too moved to speak. As they walked to their cars, Jake added, "You know, we're going to need a name for this new network of shops." Tom thought for a moment, then smiled. "How about Integrity Auto?" Jake nodded, grinning. "Perfect. Just like the man who inspired it." As Tom drove home that night, he reflected on the incredible turn his life had taken. From a small-town mechanic struggling to connect with his son, to the inspiration for a nationwide movement of community-focused auto shops. He chuckled to himself, realizing that sometimes the most powerful tools for changing the world weren't in his toolbox, but in his heart. The future was bright, full of promise and purpose. And Tom Simmons, the humble mechanic who had started it all, was ready for whatever challenges and joys it might bring. Thank you for watching The Mechanic's Heart. If this story touched you, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear about a time when someone's integrity made a difference in your life. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories that remind us of the power of kindness and authenticity. Remember, true wealth isn't measured by what's in your wallet, but by the lives you touch and the legacy you leave behind.